Welcome. Welcome to what I believe is going to be week 9 of Political Science 101. And what we're going to do is going to try to continue where we left off, which was somewhere around our discussion of the assessment of the American Revolution and the dichotomy between the interpretation that the colonists had of the rights of Parliament to tax them and to impose taxes on certain goods, and the very different and disparate viewpoint of Parliament itself. And we talked about that dichotomy in the context of what was known then and is still known now as taxation without representation, which was the battle cry, if you will, the mantra of the colonists, and that was met with the notion of virtual representation. So that's where we left off, anyways. And I'm saying this just to place this conversation in some sort of context, so you have some kind of backdrop, and we're not just delving into the stuff on the fly and without placing it in reference to what came before. Now, before I proceed with the substance of this lecture, there's a couple of points I want to make, and there's a couple of points that I think really need to be made. The first is that the previous lecture video that I released, the one prior to this, I spent about an hour and, I don't know, 25 minutes talking about various things. An hour and a half, actually, slightly more than that. I spend most of that particular recording discussing in depth, comprehensively, as extensively as you could conceive of, the test, the nature of the test, the form, the substance, my assessment of what went wrong and why, and likewise what recommendations I had to rectify the deficiencies that I saw that were endemic to that test. Now, today is Saturday, the 10th of October, I believe. Since the release of that video, which I released, I think 4 or 5 days ago now, I've had exactly 5 views, including 2 or 3 of myself. Right, so that means, well, no, I can't say the 2 of you because maybe one of you watched it twice or you inadvertently clicked on it twice. But what that tells me is that virtually nobody has watched that video. Now, I'm not taking this personally. Personally, as you know, I don't care. I'm just saying, as a matter of fact, that some of the information in that video will, I think, be valuable. Whether or not you go back there and do that now, based on what I just represented to you now, well, that's your prerogative. Whether you do that or not, it's entirely up to you. I don't care. But what I will say is that the very last, I don't know, 7 or 8, maybe 10 minutes, let's say, just to be generous, just to be sure, the very last 10 minutes of that video does actually address itself to substantive course content. And I make the point that I think had to be made at that time, and a point that I made about 10 days ago. But I'm not going to reinforce this here because you go back and listen to it for yourself, whether or not you have the motivation to do so. It's up to you. But I made certain points that could very well conceivably manifest themselves in the context of an exam question in the future. So it is foreseeable that some of that video, some of the content, especially the last stage of that video, the last 10 minutes of that video, could conceivably serve as the basis for an exam question. Whether or not that happens, I don't know, but I would recommend that you at least pay some attention to it, because if you don't, and that question does in fact arise, then you will have done yourself a disservice by not adequately preparing yourself to address that question. Now, what else do we need to talk about? Well, notwithstanding the fact that I think that it's suggestive that so few of you actually watched that video, and maybe because it was unnecessary, maybe because you deemed it to be superfluous, maybe because you thought that the commentary that I interjected in your tests was more than adequate and illuminated and edified, elucidated my understanding of your answers sufficiently, so that anything else beyond that would be excessive and gratuitous. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. But whatever it is, understand this. In general, I am going to reasonably expect you guys to do your job. And at a minimum, what that job entails is watching this video. And look, I don't think that YouTube, the algorithm that YouTube is running, doesn't take into consideration how long you've watched the video for. All it does is consider whether you actually viewed that site. So you could, in theory, click on the video, spend 2 seconds watching it, and then close out that window in your browser, and that's enough, right? I would see that, well, there's an additional view besides whatever views that I've generated for myself. So now, I wouldn't recommend doing that. Obviously, the substance and what I'm saying is important. In this class, especially, if you haven't yet assimilated yourself to this point, get ready for it now. This class, more so than I think any other class that I've ever taught before, and probably more so than most other classes that you've ever taken before, is a class that really does require a high degree of nuance. You have to know what's being talked about. You have to be sufficiently conversant with that material so as to be able to recapitulate that in your own words, not in your own voice, but in your own words. And articulate these concepts in a way that is intelligible and resonates with me so that I know that you know what you're talking about, or so that I believe that you know what you're talking about. Whether or not you actually do is a different, that's a separate argument. But so I think it behooves you to spend as much time critically evaluating what it is I'm talking about in the scope of these videos. And if you're not going to do that, that's fine. That's your right, okay? But don't come looking at me, all right? Don't come after me after the next test is over and done with, and you haven't got a satisfactory score on that test. Don't look to me or cast aspersions on anything that I've done. Look no further than the mirror, my friend, because you only have yourself to blame, assuming you haven't been doing all the sorts of things that you really ought to be doing. All right, so I'm going to leave that there. Now, the other point that I wanted to make, and the point that I made with my history group earlier today, actually, as it so happens, is to reinforce what I said in the email to you, because I don't know whether or not you guys read that email. I have to assume that you probably did, but I can't necessarily make that assumption, because it seems to me that some of you do read emails, some of you don't read emails, and some of you sort of read emails. And I don't know which of those is most defining and which of those pertains to any one of you individually. But I would strongly admonish all of you to take the emails very seriously. You haven't been doing so thus far. Now is the time to take them seriously, especially now because we have reverted to an online mode of instruction. How long is this going to continue for? The short answer is, I don't know, but probably 2 weeks from now, okay? As far as I can foresee. All right, and I can't really foresee anything or anticipate anything with any degree of prescience right now, and nobody can, because nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in 2 weeks from now. What I can say that is, if assuming the Western Upper Peninsula Health Department doesn't come to Gogabek or Tech or Finlandia or wherever else they're going to go to, and say in the next couple of weeks, hey, you guys got to revert back to online instruction because the numbers here dictate such precautions, assuming that doesn't happen, and assuming my parents vacate the premises which they're currently domiciled at, which is the house that I was previously living at until they got up there, assuming those two conditions are satisfactorily met in the next 2 weeks, then I will be back in the classroom and in the flesh for you to see and for you to hear and for you to ask questions of. Now, what I would say about the continuation of this online mode of instruction, I don't think that this is a bad thing. I don't see how this is deleterious to the interest of any of you in any way. And I've sat around and I've thought about this for quite some time. And I've tried to put myself in a position that is commensurate to your own. And I can't consider any way which this would have a tangible, deleterious, negative impact on any one of you individually or collectively, cumulatively as a group. And maybe I'm just not anticipating all the possible outcomes of this, but I think that I am. So let me say this first, right? Just for the record, and just to be clear, and just to be explicit about this, if I wasn't in the email. The reason I'm not back up north has nothing to do with the fact that I like playing Xbox in the home theater in the basement here in this house. I mean, that is an available option for me to pursue, but that's not the reason why I'm here. Furthermore, the reason is not because my girlfriend is down here and she's very attractive and she's very beguiling and I like spending time with her and she's a good cook. That could be a reason, but that's not the reason, okay? That's not the probative, dispositive reason. That's not the real decisive reason as to why I decided to stay here. It could be that I don't like driving up there because it's an arduous drive and it takes 7.5 hours for me to go door to door for 650 miles. That's an encumbrance. Well, that could be a reason, but that's not the reason either. The real reason, all right, and take this for what it is, and I hope it's something valuable. The real reason is because I am genuinely very concerned about the welfare and the well-being and the health of my parents. My parents are both in their late 70s. My dad is exceptionally feeble. He uses a cane. He had a hip replacement a couple of years ago. He's asthmatic. He has an inhaler. And if he were to contract COVID, it very well could be lethal for him. Okay, and I'm not embellishing, and I'm not sensationalizing, and I'm not making things up. I'm not making this up as I go along. This is all factually true and consistent. My mom, I don't know, but the point is that they have very significant, identifiable, cognizable uh, predispositional factors, which would in fact predispose them to a much more grievous infection, and those factors would seriously exacerbate the underlying virus if in fact they were to be afflicted with that. Now, I can't say that, I can't categorically say that, well, if I were to come up and I were to take maximum precautions and I were always to wear a mask and I were to wear my latex gloves and I were to stay distance away from people and do all the sorts of things that we ought to be doing, I can't categorically say that therefore would be enough so as to ensure that I would not contract COVID myself. I can't say that. Nobody can. I mean, you can take certain steps to affirmatively mitigate the possibility of transmission for yourself and for others, but you can never say, you can never make a categorical assertion that, well, that's going to be, that will absolutely, definitively rule out the possibility of contracting COVID. Now, the other concern that I have, if you look at the numbers right now, the rates of new cases has gone down in the last day, but that doesn't mean that it's going to continue to go down. What we're concerned about is the trend. Okay, and I'm not an epidemiologist, and I'm not a virologist, and I'm not here to lecture you about the biology of COVID or the epidemic trends. But I would say this: I mean, I am statistically trained, and I can certainly read and interpret data in a way that makes sense of it for myself, and indeed makes sense of it for others as well. So I can say this: 25%, roughly 1/4 of the cases of COVID are asymptomatic cases. And what that means is that you contract COVID, you are carrying the pathogen, you have it, it is incubating inside you, yet you don't exhibit any outward manifestations of that infection. So nobody's going to know, including yourself, right? So unbeknownst to you, unwittingly, you could be going out there comporting yourself as you ordinarily would because you're assuming that you're not sick, because you have to assume that because you're not symptomatic, and you could be engaging in behavior that, if in fact you knew that you were symptomatic, would be prima facie reckless for you to engage in. Not wearing a mask, living in close proximity with people who may have predispositional factors. And you wouldn't know that. And you wouldn't know that until you got tested. And a lot of people won't get tested just because they won't get tested until such time as they're symptomatic, until they actually exhibit outward signs of the virus. And so that's the point, all right? It's a catch-22, right? You won't get tested unless you have probable cause to believe that either you were infected, right, which may exhibit itself through symptoms, because you may manifest symptoms yourself, cough, high fever, malaise, etc., or because you were exposed to somebody who you know was infected. But absent those circumstances, assuming you came into contact with somebody who's asymptomatic, and then you yourself are an asymptomatic carrier, and then you expose yourself to people like my parents who have very cognizable predispositional factors because of their age, because of their frailty, because of the fact that if they were afflicted with this, it may very well kill them. And if in fact that happened, if that were to play out, all right, if that were a scenario that were in fact to become a real, not a hypothetical scenario, but a real one, I would be mortified, okay? And I hope you understand my rationale. I hope you can identify with my position. And I would merely say this. I would merely ask you this. I'm not assuming that, let's assume that you are in a position that is comparable to my own. Let's assume that you could, for instance, you could make the decision to continue to live here in Detroit, or anywhere for that matter. Green Bay, it could be anywhere, Chicago, right? Is a place, actually that's not true, a place where the infection rates are far less pervasive than they are in Houghton County right now. Right, so Detroit is a good example of that, right? You could continue to do that, okay? And you could continue to isolate yourself from the world and from your parents, right? Or you could make the trip all the way up north, okay? And for the sake of coming back to the classroom, to physically engaging in physical instruction with the students, right? But the liability associated with that option would be to expose yourself, right? Well, expose yourself in an epidemiological sense, not expose yourself literally, but expose yourself to your parents who both have predispositional factors, right? Knowing not whether or not you may very well contract the virus yourself. I don't think there's a very good probability of that. I think the possibility of that is very remote, but still, even if there was a 1% chance that could conceivably happen, if there was a 1% chance that I could conceivably contract COVID, and I, living in the same house, therefore, as my parents up there, because that's what they're living right now for the next 2 weeks, if I came back to that house and I either unwittingly or negligently exposed them to COVID, and they contracted that because I was asymptomatic or because I was careless or because I was negligent, right? You can't think about it in terms of the probability. You also have to think about it in terms of probability in relation to the magnitude of the threat, if in fact that particular outcome were to be realized. And the probability is small, but the severity of the implications and the magnitude of the complications would be extreme. okay? And so that's the way I adjudicate this. It's a matter of how likely is this thing to actually occur, right? And if in fact it does occur, let's assume it's a 1% chance, right? What is the potential impactfulness that could have for myself and my parents? All right, look, I could go further into this and talk about this all the long day, but I'm not going to, because I know that's not why you guys tuned into this channel, because you didn't tune into this to listen to me talk about the epidemiology of COVID or the impactfulness that it could conceivably have on my parents. But I want to say this because I want you to understand where it is I'm coming from, and I want you to understand precisely what it is that motivated my decision and what the relative probative factors were in that calculus. And I think that the most dispositive factor is the health and welfare and well-being of my parents, because that's something that I'm not willing to take a risk of jeopardizing. And I would assume that because that is the ethical position to take, and to do otherwise would be ethically unconscionable, that would be the position that any of you would maintain and subscribe to if in fact you were in my position. Okay. Now, I could say a bit more about this. I could also say a bit more about the reasons as to why I think this particular mode of instruction is one that actually lends itself to a much greater potential for academic success for all of you. I'm not going to get into any of that because I think that you either understand that implicitly or you don't. And what I may say right now may help you understand that, or may not. I don't know. But just suffice it to say, I think that this is a mode of instruction which, if we continue this, and we will, all right, so that's a given. I don't think it will not negatively impact any of you. All right, if anything, it will have a salutary effect. It will have a beneficial, advantageous effect, and I can't conceive of it being anything other than that. All right, now I want to return to our discussion of actually where we left off was not the dichotomy between virtual representation and taxation without representation, but rather we had already closed escrow on that topic. We had begun our foray into an analysis of what Jefferson had written, which is the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, or for Religious Freedom. And I had gone through that document in a very systematic manner, and I analyzed and accentuated the points that I thought were most salient, most critical, most dispositive to your understanding of the rhyme and the reason and the rationale for why Jefferson wrote that document, and the case that he makes, essentially, right? The case against the conflating of state and religion, right? Or inextricably entwining them, blending those two powers, those two functions, blending them in a way so that they are complementary to one another. The power of religion, okay, which he thought ought to be dissociated from and detached and divorced from the state, and the state, and the reasons as to why that was in fact his position and the case that he made for it. Now, I should say when your next test comes up, probably around the end of October. I can't tell you precisely when, but somewhere around there, because it's going to be about every month. When that test comes, and when I ask a question which concerns itself and addresses itself to the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, do not respond to that question by giving me block quotes from what Jefferson wrote. All right, don't do that. Okay, tell me, summarize in your own words what you think were the most quintessential elements of what he said, and you give me your own understanding of that based on my own interpretation, of course, right, or yours. I don't care either way. Just so long as you can prove to me substantially so that you are thinking about these things and analyzing them, and then giving me some kind of product of that analysis in your written response. Okay, so I've got some questions here, and these can be found in the PowerPoint slides. Speaking of which, I addressed this question to the history group, which I just recorded a lecture for about an hour and a half ago, and I'm going to address this question to all of you. How distracting is it, I should say, when I think not unreasonably request that you have the PowerPoint slides available to you to supplement this viewing, the viewing of this lecture. I guess another way of asking that would be to say, is it too much for me to expect for you to be simultaneously listening to what I'm saying, watching what I'm doing, presumably, because that's the whole point, and also immersing yourself in the PowerPoint slides, which I would have to assume you've got somewhere on your, you got a Windows OS, or maybe some of you still use Apple. I hope that's not the case, but you've got, you got a computer there, you got a laptop or a desktop, whatever it is, and you've got the PowerPoint slides, right? And you're looking at those, and you're trying to reconcile what I'm saying with what's on the slides. I don't know whether or not that is a difficult process. I mean, I would assume that if you're able to sort of parcelate your attention out and engage, multitask essentially cognitively, you can probably do that. But what I'm going to suggest, if that is very, very challenging, if that is unduly onerous, if it's creating too much of a unreasonable imposition on any of you, then I would submit that what I could do, okay, and this is the alternative, all right, if you don't think that the YouTube video recordings are working out very well, and the reason I'm proposing this is because I don't know what's going to happen with respect to the decisions that the college is going to be making in the future here. All right, it's anybody's guess. I was astonished that the UP Public Health Department said we can go back and we can return to physical instruction on Monday, which is the 12th. I was astonished. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a medical professional, but like I said, if you look at the data, if you look at the relevant numbers, it was fairly disconcerting that they made the decision. Now, that being said, I don't think it's very probable that we will continue to be conducting physical class instruction in the classroom. I don't think that's very likely. So this is something that, going forward, I would like to get some sense and some consensus in terms of what you guys prefer, what your preference is with respects to how I actually broadcast and disseminate this material. I don't care, all right? I can keep sitting here in this chair or on this desk or wherever in this room and just do this, okay? I can do this. This is fine. I don't mind talking to the camera. I'm getting used to it. It takes some getting used to, but I've gotten over that. Or what I could do is I could just make audio recordings. You wouldn't have the visual, okay? So you wouldn't be able to see me. Not that that really matters. I don't really care. I don't know if you care. Maybe you do. I mean, I guess the video makes the experience more immersive, more engaging, perhaps. I don't know. All right, maybe it's a more effective simulacrum of the classroom. Perhaps that's what you think. I don't know. But what I could do in lieu of this, if it's difficult to balance the video/audio feed that comes from YouTube with the imperative to also reconcile what I'm saying simultaneous with the slides that you hopefully are viewing in conjunction with listening to this and watching this. If that's too much to ask, all right, if that just requires too much of your attention and it's difficult to balance those competing interests, then what I could do is I could just make an audio recording and then embed that audio recording in the slides themselves. And that way you won't have a video, okay, so that may be a bad thing, that may be a good thing. I don't know, maybe the video is distracting. I have no idea, right? But what you would have is you would have my interpretation of the slides, and you would have that interpretation associated with the particular slide that I'm addressing myself to, right? You don't know, I mean, I'm not saying that you don't have that right now. I'm trying to circumscribe my comments to these slides as best as I can, and I'm also trying to make a point of telling you when I'm moving and advancing through the slides. And maybe I'm doing a good job at that, maybe I'm not. Again, so I haven't had any feedback yet from any of you guys, okay? And this brings me back to the point about I think the redundancy of having physical instruction in a class where nobody ever asked me any questions, okay? That's not to say nobody ever asked me any questions. I think there were 2 people that asked me a couple of questions thus far, maybe 4 questions in total, but that's not very many questions over the course of 6 weeks of instruction. It's very few, right? So I don't think there's a very high probability or likelihood of future questions arising in the course of our instructional discourse here. It's really more of a monologue, as it always has been with me. So if it's a monologue, might as well have it on YouTube. Might as well have it on an audio recording embedded in your PowerPoint slides. That's the way I look at it, and that's the way I hope you see it as well. Okay, so that's question number 1. All right, is whether this continued usage and reliance upon YouTube is conducive to your understanding of the materials, or whether you think it would be more ideal, more optimal for your purposes, for your pedagogical learning purposes, for me to just make audio recordings and then embed them in the PowerPoint slides, and then you have a little icon, it's like a little microphone, you click on that, and then you just listen to whatever I have to say on any particular slide. Maybe that's easier, maybe it's more intuitive, maybe it's more streamlined and concise, I don't know, all right? This is up to you, okay? This is your guys' class. I'm giving you some discretionary control over how the content is arranged, the formatting at least, and you can either take it or leave it. Okay, either way, I don't care. Either way, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. Okay, but I'm giving you some prerogative. I'm giving you some discretionary control over that. So hopefully you seize upon that. All right. Finally, turning to the Virginia statute for religious freedom, I got some questions here that I was going to try to get around to last time, but I never got around to because I was too busy talking about the statute itself. So I don't know if I have the statute with me, actually. And if I don't, that's unfortunate. No, I don't. Okay, well, that's problematic, but I'm not going to pause this, guys, because this is just going to be too drawn out otherwise. All right, the first question. I'll try to do this without the statute in front of me. All right, and I'm pretty familiar with what Jefferson says, so I don't think I need it here. I ask this. I say, what can we infer about the relationship between organized religion and the state by the nature of Jefferson's critique? Okay, so what is our understanding? What's the takeaway here when we look at what Jefferson is saying when he critically evaluates the relationship between church and state up until this point? Well, we can say a couple of things. First of all, we can say that Jefferson is very wary of the fact that the state is in many ways influenced by how religion interprets things, and vice versa. That there ought not be a connection between these two entities, which should be separable. Now, why is that the case? He makes some arguments, and I think they have varying degrees of conviction. But I would say that one of the primary reasons why this is problematic as far as Jefferson is concerned is because he doesn't like the idea of religion, which is completely subjective in terms of its interpretation of morality. He doesn't like religion contaminating the state, because he thinks that religion has this invidious influence on the state. It's infecting the state. It's undermining the efficacy of the state because it's interjecting some subjective element into a process which really should be completely separable from any sort of theology. Okay, it's what he's not saying is that the state should not be informed by philosophy. All right, that would be a separate issue. That would be a separate argument. What he's saying is that the state should not be informed by theology. Okay, and because the difference between theology and philosophy is that everybody, well, not everybody, but a lot of people have a lot of different ways of looking at theology, right? You have Hindus, you have Jews, you have Buddhists, you have Christians, you have Muslims, you have etc., right? And he's saying that if you make the creation of the state, or the legislation that the state enacts, the laws that the state promulgates, or the codes that the state operates by, or the voting registration requirements, or the other things that are being promulgated by a state. If you modulate that, if you make that subject to the influence of religion, then it is necessarily going to prejudice people who are not associated with that particular religion. And the state should represent the interests of all citizens, without qualifying, right? Without any further stipulation, right? It should represent the interests of all citizens, and it should not, therefore, be controlled by or undermined in its objectivity by certain theocratic dogmas or doctrines that derive from a subjective interpretation of religious texts. He's saying that, again, these things only have the capacity to contaminate and therefore undermine the efficacy of the state in its capacity to adjudicate matters objectively and dispassionately in a way that doesn't necessarily take into the personal interests of any individual citizen. That it rather it looks at people and it treats them fairly across the board, right? It doesn't adjudicate punishments. It doesn't give special preference or special dispensation to people based on what particular religion they adhere to. No, and that's not what the state is supposed to do. So I think that's one problem that Jefferson identified. We can also say that that's probably enough. How is the existing nexus between religion and governmental service an impediment to the Republican ideals espoused by Jefferson? How is the existing nexus between religion and governmental services an impediment to the Republican ideals espoused by Jefferson? Right. So I think what he's saying about this is that government government's ability to be impartial, to look at things impartially, is going to be obfuscated or compromised by this notion that religion should be associated with the state. That since for a long time before Jefferson was writing this, the state was always sort of governed by religion, and much of what the state did was modified by religion or controlled by religion, then looking at that retrospectively, saying that's not a good thing. Okay, that's not a good thing. Um, the other thing that Jefferson says here, okay, and I guess I already answered all these questions. It's just a matter of going back and listening to what I said in the previous lecture, because when I was going through this document, I anticipated these questions and I answered them, I think, fairly clearly. Maybe I didn't explicitly say that, but the the other problem is that you can't necessarily have a religion that says that this religion is going to be preeminent and this religion is going to be controlling, and that no other religion is going to be given the kind of preference and the kind of particular access to the state that this religion is granted, because that necessarily prejudices certain of your citizens. You can't, I mean, this is going back to what Madison was saying about you can't force everybody to believe the same thing or subscribe to the same kind of faction, right? And you can't, therefore, enforce or compel or coerce everybody to believe in the same religion. And if people are going to have different religious viewpoints, which invariably they will, then it would be unseemly for the state to say that one religion is going to have preference over others. One religion is going to have preference and take precedence over others. And I think one of the things that Jefferson talks about in this connection is this is going back to when he's discussing the requirements that certain citizens make professions of faith before they run for office or before they're appointed magistrates or judges or whatever it happens to be, right? That your faith is sort of a precondition, it's a prerequisite to you achieving something in the context of your civic duties or your civic prerogatives or your civic aspirations, whatever they may be. That those two things should be completely separable, and they shouldn't need to be separated. All right. In addition to the more obvious benefits which accrue to the citizenry as a consequence of the promulgation of Jefferson's statute, are there any more subtle benefits which religion itself may conceivably derive? Well, yeah, because what Jefferson said is that it's not just that by interjecting religion into the state is somehow contaminated, right? That's true, okay, because the state can't operate in a completely objective and dispassionate manner because it's going to be modulated by religion, and that's going to give certain people preference and prejudice others, right? So that's going to diminish the capacity of the state to do its job, to properly function in relation to all the citizens and treat them fairly and adjudicate matters impartially, right? But the other problem is that it incentivizes people to make disingenuous professions of faith. Because if you're living in Delaware or Rhode Island, and you have to be a Quaker or a Mennonite or something of that nature, right? You're going to be Calvinist, right? If you live in Rhode Island, right? Hypothetically, I don't know if this were actually the case, but it was the case that if you lived in Maryland, you had to be Catholic, right? If you lived in, I think it was Virginia, you had to be a Protestant until this statute was promulgated and began to be enforced. And so what that does is it creates an artificial incentive to go out there, and if you aspire to run for office or if you aspire to have anything to do with the way in which the state operates, then you go out there and you make this disingenuous profession of faith, even though you don't really truly believe in the dogma, the teachings of that particular interpretation of God or the Bible or whatever the profession of faith actually stipulates, right? You just do it because it's expedient, because it's politically expedient for you to do so, right? So he's saying that religion corrupts the state, okay, but the state also corrupts or undermines in its fundamental integrity the edifice of religion, because you have people that would be incentivized, would be highly motivated to go out there and claim that they accept Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior, and that they've been redeemed, and they seek contrition, etc. Right? But they're doing that not because they believe that their immortal soul is in peril, right? They're doing that because merely they want to get ahead politically, or they want to have some rights that otherwise would be disenfranchised from them because they're not a member of the religious majority in any given state. So this is one of those things where, look at this and how does this intersect with the recurrent theme that we've talked about thus far regarding faction? Well, if you have all these different religions and they're controlling different aspects of the state, and there are certain prerequisites that you profess this particular belief and you subscribe to this particular church, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, then that's gonna create and engender a greater degree of divisiveness and contentiousness amongst the citizenry. That's going to create faction. All right, that's going to be very much conducive to the proliferation of faction, because you have different people who necessarily interpret their faith in a different way and who subscribe to different religious precepts. And of course, these people are going to be represented across the vast continuum of different people who can comprise your citizenry. You're going to have these different people, right? And so what Jefferson is saying is we can't allow all of them to interfere with the government with respects to their particular faith and imposing their beliefs on the government, so that the government accepts and embraces those beliefs and proceeds on the basis of the truthfulness of those claims, right? Well, then what we should do, therefore, rather is we should treat all of them equally. Okay, don't give preferential consideration to any one faith, but rather treat them equally. Okay, let's not subsidize any one of them. Let's not subsidize any of them. Okay, right? We're not going to go out there. We're not going to support any church. We're not going to support, so, because these are the options that Jefferson has. Right? He could have made several recommendations. He could have said, well, because there's all these churches and there's all these different faiths, and obviously the people who subscribe to these faiths take them very seriously, we could mandate that the state subsidize, pay money to support each and every one of these faiths, right? As to subsidize them across the board, right? Or we could subsidize one of them, right? We could give preferential consideration to one of them, right, over the others, right? Or we could just treat them as all equals, okay? And we're not going to give any of them money, okay? We're just going to let them go out there and preach as much as they want, right? We're not going to impede them in that because that's their right. But we're not going to give them any government funding, because that would be contrary to the notions of what a republic really ought to be and what we aspire to create in terms of a republic. And that's the best option, okay? That's the best option. Now, is the last paragraph of the statute intelligible on its face, or is there some logical inconsistency here? And again, unfortunately, I don't have the statute in front of me. I forgot to bring it, or it's somewhere around here, and I don't know where to put it. But if you remember what I was saying about the very last point that Jefferson makes in that very last paragraph, he says something about how the legislatures here in Virginia have to respect and defer to the legislation that was promulgated by the legislators who came before us, right? We have to respect and defer to that. But however, we also can amend it, okay? We can amend it, right? But then he goes on to add the additional qualifier by saying that but if we the legislature here in Virginia, if his legislator, he being a legislator, if we, those who are concerned with this Virginia statute for religious freedom, if we enact this as a statute, and if we stipulate that this is a statute which concerns itself with basic, inalienable, fundamental human rights, then that renders that statute that we just enacted impervious to amendment or to being rescinded by subsequent legislators. All right. So what he's saying is he's saying, well, we have the right to amend that which comes before us, but nobody who comes after us has the right to change anything that we've done. Right. That's essentially what I think he's saying. Okay. Now you can disagree, but I think a fair and reasonable interpretation of what he wrote there in that last paragraph does in fact lend itself to that interpretation. He's saying that that's the nature of a legislator. But then he's being somewhat disingenuous by saying that as long as we say, well, we qualify this particular act or this particular law or whatever it is we're enacting here We qualify it by saying that this particular act is something that is done in furtherance of fundamental human interests. It concerns itself with the human rights of the citizens themselves. If he qualifies it by saying that, well, then that particular act that is being promulgated by the legislature, that is something that is not subject to review or amendment or being revoked or overridden or canceled out or vetoed, right? You can't change that, right? It's immutable, okay? But he's saying he is allowing himself the right, along with his fellow members of the Virginia House of Burgesses, he's allowing him and his colleagues to go and to add on to what the existing laws of Virginia say, right? And to obviously therefore amend the Constitution of Virginia, right? But he's disallowing, okay, he's delimiting the potential for subsequent future potential legislators to do to his legislation what he's doing to those who came before him. Now, that seems to me to be rather inconsistent, okay? And again, part of this class is it's not just understanding why these guys are saying what they're saying, but it's looking at this and it's understanding, you know, what's the takeaway here, all right? How do we make sense out of this, all right? And is there something that is fundamentally flawed about the rationale that this particular person is offering, whether it's Jefferson or Madison or whoever, right? And I think there's a lot of that to be found. And this is you know, this is an analytical exercise. You got to be analyzing these things. Okay. Now I'm moving on to the next slide, and this slide is entitled "The American Revolution." I think there's other slides that are entitled "The American Revolution." No, actually, maybe this is the only one. Okay, it says the American Revolution, and the first point here is talking about the Boston Tea Party. So, the Boston Tea Party was a bunch of colonists who were very upset with what was known as the Stamp Act, okay, and what later became known as the Intolerable Acts. And these were acts that Parliament over in the United Kingdom was passing, was promulgating, and was imposing upon the colonists over here in the 13 colonies. And this goes back to the original argument, which is no taxation without representation. But the problem that the colonists had at this particular time was that the Parliament was essentially mandating that the colonists must get their tea from the British East India Company, which was a corporate sort of conglomerate that was run by the British government at the time, and there were no other private tea importers that were allowed to compete against the British East India Company. And the colonists, they liked their tea. It was like crack cocaine to these guys. And they liked their tea so much that they wanted some choice. They wanted some options. And the colonists didn't like the fact that the British East India Company, pursuant to the acts that were being promulgated by Parliament at the time, was able to corner the market, was able to monopolize the market with respect to tea. Okay, tea was very important to these people. Don't ask me why. I never really liked tea. I don't know what's the big deal is about it, but it was very important for them. Okay, and they couldn't live without it. And so the British government was essentially saying to these people, well, you've got to pay this extra tax that we, the British government, are going to impose upon this tea that's being imported to you, the colonists, right? And we, the British government, have the right to increase that tax, right, independently of what you, the consumer, the colonists, says or thinks or does about it, right? There's nothing you can do to change that. Okay. Now the colonists thought that was a bit tyrannical. They thought that was unfair, and that was not giving equitable consideration to the interests of the colonists themselves, pursuant to the doctrine of virtual representation. Okay, they said, okay, British government, okay, legislate the Parliament over there, the legislative apparatus, right? Fine, you can impose these taxes, right? But do so in a way that is consonant with and reconciles that new tax with your argument, that the virtual representation argument that you use to defend your right to taxes in the first place. And if you follow the virtual representation argument, right, what it incipiently at its core, it says that we, the members of Parliament, are going to take into fair consideration the interests of all the people who on whose behalf we speak for, not just some, right? So we're going to look at the impactfulness of this legislation on the colonists as they're going over there and they're buying their tea in Boston and New Hampshire and Rhode Island and wherever they're buying their tea from, right? We're going to look at how substantial that impact is on them, all right, and how profoundly deleterious it is for their interests, and then we're going to try to measure that against whatever benefits the British government can derive from this tax that we're associating with the tea, with the sale of tea over there. Now, you could obviously, I mean, the case could be made. In fact, the case was made that, well, look, the Parliament has sovereign legislative prerogative, which means that they can go ahead and enact any legislation they very damn well please, right? But that's just the problem, okay? Because then the colonists are going to say, well, you're not acting in a manner that is consistent with the notion of virtual representation, because you're not actually allowing the colonial interests, right, to influence how you go about evaluating the justice of any particular set of laws that you enact. So I think that's the fundamental issue here, and it was one that was fundamentally irreconcilable. It was one where the British felt that they had the right to go ahead and issue these taxes and raise the taxes on tea or whatever goods that were being imported to the colonies that they felt they could raise taxes on, because that was their right and because that's the way it had always been done. And the colonists said, no, this is not what we signed up for. We're not treating us as British subjects, even though we technically are British subjects. You're treating us less than British subjects, okay? Because we have no control over what the Parliament does, because we have no access to the elections. And so what the colonists did is they got together, they organized themselves in sort of a militia organization, and they went down to the Boston Harbor, and they were dressed up as Native Americans. Okay, they were dressed up like Native Americans. Now, I think that if anybody did something even remotely comparable to this in the 21st century, I mean, we would look at it and we'd say that's ludicrous, that's absurd, right? But we'd also denigrate it because it's highly disrespectful to the interests of the Native Americans, right? Because what they're saying, when you go out there and you put the feather headdress on and you wear the I don't know, the leather coat they wear, the waistcoat they wore, and you got the decorative accoutrements on there, and you go out there with a tomahawk. What you're saying is essentially, I mean, what you're communicating by doing that, by representing yourself as a Native American, is that this kind of criminal action is the kind of behavior that we would ordinarily associate with these Native Americans, right? So you're also doing so under the guise of somebody else, right? It's like you're masking your true identity because you know that you should be ashamed by virtue of what you're doing. You're ashamed of doing what you're doing. It's like the anti-fascists, the anti-fa people, right? They all wear the Guy Fawkes mask from V for Vendetta, the movie. Why do they wear that, right? Why does the Klan wear hoods over their faces? Well, the Klan would probably say, well, it's tradition. We've been doing it since 1868 or whatever. But the real reason is because it confers some anonymity on them when they're engaged in acts of criminality and incivility and all other sorts of unconscionable behaviors. And I think that is the argument that the participants of the Boston Tea Party would have made, right? Or that's the way they conceptualize this anyway, right? We're going to go out there as a bunch of Native Americans, Fawkes, pseudo-Native Americans, right? And we are going to represent ourselves as these Native Americans because this is exactly the kind of thing you'd associate with a bunch of Native Americans, right? A bunch of drunken hooliganism, violating the laws, right? Disrespecting people's property, etc. So what did they do? They go out there, they forcibly board a British East India Company ship, which is the ship that works for the British government, the government's corporation, right? That brings the tea across from India or from Pakistan or wherever it comes from. And they board this ship, and then what do? They start dumping the product over the side of the ship. Okay. Now, this, to my mind, I mean, from a legal standpoint, this is nothing more than criminal trespass, right? Malicious destruction of property, MDOP. Okay. And maybe assault and battery with respect to the people that were on that ship, right? Not to mention defamation of the Native Americans by virtue of what you're doing. Okay. There's a tangible defamation in terms of literally masquerading as Native Americans and participating in this criminal action, and therefore associating the Native Americans with the criminality of the action that you're partaking in. So I think that on many, many levels, there are things that are problematic about this particular response by the colonists to a form of legislation which they found to be unduly draconian and too onerous and obtrusive to their lives. So I think what you have to say here is there are, there are legal proper recourses available to anybody, right? Whether you're well, of course, and I guess that depends. I guess the if you follow that to completion, that depends. If you're a colonist, I think the argument would be, well, there was no legal recourse precisely because we don't have representation in the parliament, and therefore we have to take matters into our own hands, and we have to act aggressively and impetuously and perhaps even criminally, right? So as to impress upon the British and the rest of the colonists, the citizens of the colonies, just how significant a problem this is for us, just how seriously we take this, and just how seriously impactful it is on all of us. And so I think that will be maybe the argument in defense of, or to mitigate the culpability of these otherwise criminal conspirators here. But I look at this and I think to myself, well, it's like, if you guys have been following the news cycle here in Michigan recently, and there's a lot of news, and most of it's bad. But one of the more, I think, ridiculous pieces of news that just recently came out of, I don't know who reported on this first, but the last couple of days, there was a report of a, excuse me guys, it's been a long day. There was a report of a group of aspiring Michigan militia members who came together and formed this ad hoc organization, and they plotted and conspired together to kidnap and potentially assassinate. Who knows what they're actually going to do, but at least kidnap the Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And they were gonna do this because ostensibly they were upset by the fact that she was overextending her executive prerogative and acting in a way that they deemed to be capricious and unlawful and inconsistent with the Michigan State Constitution and etc. And maybe that's the case, right? I mean, and now I think that actually has been ruled by the judiciary to act, in point of fact, to be the case, right? Because the Michigan Supreme Court recently decided that many of the executive orders that went into force no longer have the force of law because Gretchen, in fact, did overstep her executive prerogative, and she did issue orders that were beyond the scope of her authority, her lawful, constitutionally derived authority. But the point here is that there are ways to challenge that. Okay, you challenge that by filing a lawsuit against the governor, which is exactly what the gyms here did, the Michigan Association of Fitness Facilities, whatever it is. That's who initiated this lawsuit. Or you go out there and you protest in the streets, or you go and you recruit like-minded citizens and you say, all right, let's go out there and let's advocate for a ballot initiative, okay, a plebiscite, okay, let's have a they do this in California in certain states. They have propositions. Proposition 8, okay, I think it dealt with whether or not the state of California recognized a marriage between two homosexual people. But they have these opportunities whereby the people of the state can engage in a participatory voting scheme, and they can decide to recall certain state officials, including the governor. Right? Well, that's the way you go about doing this. What you don't do is you don't get 6 or 7 of your best buddies together in your trailer and get your ARs and your Glocks together, and you decide to make a plan to assault the Capitol building, and you can decide to kidnap the governor. You don't do that, right? Because that transgresses upon the laws, and we are a nation of laws. We have to defer to those laws. So I think that what in some respects, what the colonists were doing was analogous to what these guys, these rather foolish and not very savvy individuals here in Michigan, conspired to do when they decided to formulate this plan to kidnap the governor. And in fact, one of the things that they try to analogize themselves to was that we're the freedom fighters, right? We're the American revolutionaries. We're fighting against the tyranny of the British government, or it's like that. It's analogous to that. I would submit that it's not. And the reason why it's not analogous is because these guys, the participants in the Tea Party, the participants, not participants, the co-conspirators and those who were responsible for what we refer to as the Tea Party, they didn't really have any legal recourse available to them, right? They couldn't vote. They couldn't initiate a recall. What could they do? What other available avenues did they have to pursue? So I think that's the argument for this. All right. So the question here, and some of what I said already anticipated this, but regardless of the legitimacy of the incipient grievance, okay, so we can all admit that it's not fair for Parliament to be taxing people who don't have access to parliamentary elections. That they don't have the capacity to vote for people who actually sit in Parliament, and therefore they're not represented literally. In fact, and you could say, whether or not they're represented virtually, that's an arguable case, but they're not actually represented. Okay, so you could say, well, that's maybe that's a legitimate grievance, right? Um, Regardless of how legitimate that grievance may be, though, can the behavior of the colonists be justified retrospectively? If you say that they were entitled to engage in mob action and to rampage, loot and plunder, merely in response to the appropriateness of the government's conduct, then what do you say to the proposition that we are a nation of laws? And do the ideological ends always justify the anarchical and criminal means? Well, no. I would say no. The answer. So in reverse order, the answer is no to that second question. Uh, the ideological ends don't always justify the means, in the sense that just because you may have a good cause, that you think that you're fighting for a cause that is just and a cause that is in the interests of the majority of the citizens because you don't have equitable relief, well, that doesn't necessarily give you license to go out there and to pursue whatever your cause happens to be with reckless abandon, without any consideration for the rights of other people, right? No, implicit in all of this is that we have to proceed based on the notion that we are living in a nation of laws, right? Now I think that this paradigm is not precisely symmetrical to or congruent with the context of the Boston Tea Party in the 1770s, the 1760s, or whenever this was. It's not precisely representative, because you could say that the colonists really didn't have legal recourse. They couldn't, they couldn't petition their elected representatives because they had no elected representatives. Well, could they have filed a motion in court? Well, yeah, there were courts, right? But the courts were all controlled by the British, and the courts in the colonies were all known as admiralty courts, so they're kind of like military courts. And so it was unlikely that the colonists, if in fact they filed a lawsuit in the courts, that they would receive some kind of equitable remedy as a result of the judicial process. That's unlikely. But if you look at this and say that this is representative of sort of the apotheosis of the American tradition, that we have certain rights, they are so inexorable and inalienable to who we are, and they define who we are in terms of our citizenship status, that if those rights are in any way infringed upon, then that necessarily gives us the obligation, the duty and the right, and the duty, though, to go out there and to engage in all manner of criminality, right? To resist what we construe as being an unjust adulteration or constraining of our civil liberties and civil rights. Does the transgressions of a government executive, does the transgressions upon civil liberties and civil rights by the government, does that necessarily entitle the citizens to go out there and to engage in criminal behavior? Well, I think that's a difficult question to answer, but I would think that the answer fundamentally is no in most cases, because what are you doing in response to this? I guess it depends on how you proceed, right? I mean, are you inflicting damage upon private property that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to people who are not necessarily affiliated with the government? Are you doing that? Because then you're just causing all kinds of destruction that is not necessary, and it's not in furtherance of your purposes, right? In furtherance of achieving some kind of resolution or relief for whatever underlying grievance you initially had. By going out there and dumping tea in Boston Harbor, okay, over the side of the ship, do you think that is going to compel the British government to look more leniently or empathetically on the interests of the colonists? Or conversely, do you think the British government is going to respond in the opposite way, that this is going to serve to antagonize the relationship between the colonists and the British government? Well, of course, It's exactly what it's going to do. It's going to exacerbate the underlying tensions. And if that's true in the context of the Boston Tea Party, then I think we can extrapolate beyond that. We could say, well, that's true in any context when you respond with violence, okay? Especially when you have some viable legal recourse available to you to pursue relief through other more equitable and less violent means. And if you immediately default to violence, well, then that says more about you than it says about the underlying grievance that inspired you to resort to that violence in the first place. Okay, so I think that's part of the understanding that we have here, is that this says a lot about the character of the people who participated in this act of what essentially was an act of criminality. Right? It was an act that was transgressing upon the rights of the property owners, and it was also transgressing upon the laws that existed at that time. All right. Do our perceptions of events that may have originally been been construed as acts of righteous indignation evolve with the passage of time, allowing for a more objective and dispassionate analysis? Yeah, that's the whole point, right? I mean, that's the point that I've been trying to make here for the last 15 minutes, is that we don't look at the people who participated in the Boston Tea Party and say, just across the board unequivocally, oh, they're all heroes of the revolution, right? Those guys were all doing what anybody else would have done under the circumstances. We can completely justify every single thing that they did. I don't think anybody is saying that. I don't know how you could say that. You could say, well, this is a historical process, right? This was going to happen. If they didn't do it, then somebody else would have done it. Okay, well then let somebody else do it, right? But don't descend, don't condescend to the point where you're sullying your own integrity by engaging in acts of criminal behavior. So I think that, yes, our understanding of this event has changed. It has changed substantially over the previous 260 years or so. And we don't just look at this as a purely glorious act of resistance and defiance against tyranny. Nobody looks at it that way anymore. I mean, that's a very simplistic interpretation of this event. What I think you have to do is you have to look at it, you have to sort of balance both sides in terms of why they did what they did, and is if a similar situation arose today, right, where the government infringed promulgated legislation, right, either did something or failed to do something through its acts or omissions, right, but through their acts or omissions, it resulted in some kind of deleterious consequence for a particular constituency here in the United States. If somebody's rights, their civil rights or their civil liberties, are infringed upon by virtue of what either the government does or by virtue of the fact that the government failed to act when they should have acted, okay, does that give that person or that group of persons whose rights have been infringed upon, does that give them the right, and maybe some would say the ability or the duty or the obligation, right? Does that vindicate their desire to go out there and violently resist what they subjectively construe to be the tyranny of the government? Is that ever necessarily the case? Is that ever necessarily true to say that if the government crosses this particular line, then it's time to unleash full Boston Tea Party on the government, right? It's time to just start going and wrecking up, the federal arsenal over there in Munising. Okay, we're gonna go ransack the federal arsenal and steal some tanks and a bunch of ARs from there. Is that ever right to say that kind of behavior, that line of thinking is justifiable? Well, it's certainly not. I mean, it depends. I think it depends on just how egregious the underlying offense is by the government. If you say that the governor of the state of Michigan is transgressing upon, her constitutional prerogative to issue executive orders, and she's promulgating orders that are capricious or that violate the constitutional rights of certain citizens here in Michigan, does that necessarily give you the right to grab your gun and to plan to assassinate or kidnap the governor? I would say no. I would say that is an asymmetrical and disproportionate response. It's out of proportion. The magnitude of the response is not symmetrical to, is incongruous with the extent to which you are experiencing negative effects as a consequence of what the government is doing, whatever they happen to be doing. In this particular case, they're not opening the gyms on time, right? Now, what if you what if you change this hypothetical a little bit, right? And let's say, well, now the government is doing something that genuinely does infringe upon the fundamental civil liberties of a certain subset of American citizens. That they dispossess a certain subset of American citizens of their fundamental right to participate in the voting process, let's say. Now this is not just a theoretical academic exercise, because you could say, well, that's kind of what's going on right now in the with respects to the mail-in voting situation. That many people who don't necessarily have the means to go physically to the polls and pull the lever with the machine, right? That because the federal government is insisting upon a higher level of scrutiny that's being applied to these mail-in ballots that are coming in, that is going to disenfranchise a certain subset of the population who otherwise would have the right to vote. And now you look at COVID, right? And there are certain people, like my parents, I talked about in the introduction of this particular lecture, right, who will not go and vote in person precisely because they know that doing so would expose them to an unnecessary hazard. Now, is it reasonable for the federal government to say that, well, if you're not willing to do that, okay, if you're not willing to physically go to the polling center and have your ID and have your state, identification card and whatever else we require you to bring with you, if you're not willing to do that, then you know what, you can't rely upon the mail-in voting system, because, or if you do rely upon the mail-in voting system, then we the government are going to insist on a higher level of scrutiny, which is going to require you to actually establish through documentation your identity more extensively than you would be required if in fact you were to go and pull the ballot, pull the lever in person. Does that alienate a certain subset of the population? I would submit that yes, it does. Okay. Now, does that constituency, that subset of the American population who feels as though they've been alienated because there's this very scrupulous requirement for mail-in ballots, does that subset, does that the extent to which they feel alienated, the extent to which they feel disenfranchised, does that give them the right to go out in the streets and start looting and pillaging and burning and rampaging and destroying things and engaging in all sorts of violence against random people? I would say, well, again, this is all open to interpretation. Okay, some of you may say, well, yes, yeah, voting is a constitutionally guaranteed right. It's a protected right. You can't be infringing upon that anyway. And if you infringe upon it a little bit, it's the same as infringing upon it a lot. Okay, you can't just take a little bit of it away. It's like the Second Amendment, right? You can't just take a little bit of the right to keep and bear arms away, right? If you begin to take some of it away, well, then that opens it up for more massive modification and greater adulteration. So the point here is that it really depends on your perspective, but for my purposes, I don't personally think that if you felt as though you were being disenfranchised by the government because they were telling you that if you don't vote in person and if you mail your ballot in, then it's going to be subjected to a higher level of scrutiny. I don't necessarily think that gives you the right to go out there and to engage in criminality. I don't think it's. I think if the government was saying, we're going to begin exterminating Native Americans like we used to do, right? Like in the bad old days of the 19th century, right? The United States government is going to say, we're going to create this special task force of elite military operators of the 82nd Airborne and the 101st and the Delta Force and the Navy SEALs and the Army Rangers and the rest of these guys. And we're going to get these guys together. We're going to call them the SS, okay, the Security Service. And we're going to send them out to the reservations, and they're going to be responsible for rounding up all the Native Americans and just exterminating them. Okay? Now, if the government did that, I think that you may very well have the right to engage in Tea Party-like antics, and in fact, perhaps even go a little bit further than that. So, these questions lend themselves to the analogy that I try to make on the next slide here, which is I've got a picture here. I got two pictures here. One on the left is supposed to be a depiction of a more modern day representation of what the Tea Party ostensibly looked like as far as this artist's perception of it was concerned. Just a bunch of guys dressed up like Native Americans. In fact, I don't think they. Oh yeah, one guy's wearing a headdress. Okay. And I'm trying to equivocate this with what's happening right now with BLM and Antifa and the radical left and all the radicalism and all the hooliganism and the criminality that we see on the streets. This is a picture from a Target store. I think this may have been in Kenosha, but it could also be down in Cook County in Chicago, or the Chicago area. Either way, it doesn't matter. I hate Target. Target's a terrible store. Their commercials are ridiculously stupid. Um, is Are these two things synonymous? Is it fair to say that what the perpetrators of the Boston Tea Party were doing, right? That is functionally equivalent to what this guy who's smashing the checkout counter at Target, what he's doing. Is this the same thing? Is taking a ball peen hammer to the automatic checkout machine at Target the modern day 21st century equivalent of throwing a box of tea over the side of a ship, a British East India Company ship in Boston Harbor? Are these two things really analogous? Is this the same thing? Well, be careful how you answer that question, because I would say you look at it in terms of the degree of the underlying grievance, the magnitude of the underlying grievance that inspired these guys to act in the way that they're acting. Now, what is the underlying grievance with respect to the Tea Party? What motivated the Tea Partiers to go and engage in the malicious destruction of property and the other sorts of crimes that they engaged in? Well, they said that they didn't have adequate representation in Parliament, that there were these tariffs that they were complaining about. They had to pay extra money for tea. Okay, that's it's not that bad, right? And what did they do in response to that? Well, they destroyed some property. They trespassed, and then that was about it. Okay, and they defamed the Native Americans, right? They defamed the culture of the Native Americans. Well, we're not going to count that against them because that's not part of the calculus. What's going on in exhibit number B here? Okay, exhibit B. What's going on here? What is the magnitude of the underlying grievance that these hooligans have? Right, because that's what they are. I mean, they're hooligans, right? They're criminals. They're destroying private property. What is the underlying grievance that they have? Well, they're saying that Black Lives Matter and the police, there's systemic racism in this country, and the police are out there to put their knee on the necks of African Americans and dispossess African Americans of their fundamental rights, and we feel alienated, we feel disenfranchised, we feel as though our lives are being threatened. Now, I think that again, a lot of this depends on the relative weight that you give to these various factors, but I think to say that I'm going to go to the Target store in Kenosha, Wisconsin, and destroy the self-checkout machine because some guy in Minneapolis, who, by the way, was breaking the law, right, who was actually engaged in criminal behavior when he was being detained, right? Some guy in Minneapolis had the misfortune of having been subjected to certain abuses by the Minneapolis Police Department. That therefore gives me the right to go into this Target in Chicago or Cook County or Kenosha or wherever it happens to be, and just begin to rampage about and destroy all this property in here and steal things as well. Is there a symmetry? Is there a logical causal connection between point one in time, the guy in Minneapolis having his civil rights abused and infringed upon by the Minneapolis Police Department, and the response that ostensibly elicited in Kenosha, right? Does this logically correlate? Well, let's ask that same question about the Tea Party analogy, right? Is it logical to say that if you're a colonist and you're offended by the overreach of Parliament, right, because they're imposing taxes on tea, which you think is arbitrary and excessive, and they're doing this unilaterally without your consent because you have no consent because you're not represented, does it make sense, if you're upset with that, does it make sense to go and target a British East India Company ship, which, by the way, is a company that's affiliated with the British government? It's a government company. Does it make sense to go there and target that ship and limit your outrages and limit your criminal capriciousness to the merchandise and the hardware that is on that ship? Is there some sort of causal relationship between those two things? Is that consonant? Is that symmetrical? I would say in a way, yes, it is. Okay, because you're directing your outrage and your anger and your criminal response against, in a way, a totem, a symbol of a manifestation of the company which works on behalf of the government, who is responsible for infringing upon the rights which you think are constitute such an egregious offense that warrants you going out there and throwing tea over the side of the ship, right? So you could say that does kind of make sense. That response makes sense given the underlying grievance. Now, extending that argument or extending that analysis to the Antifa people and whoever else is in that Target store, and who knows who they are. I mean, I don't want to make any judgment on these people. All I can say is that I think the judgment that must be rendered is that they're engaged in criminal behavior, and that's, that's a pretty incontrovertible judgment. But beyond that, what can we say? Can we say, yeah, you know what? I think that by going to your local Target store and just destroying the shit out of that place, that's gonna redress all the systemic racism that exists in this country. That's really gonna cause white cops to think twice before they put their knee on the back of the black man's head next time they arrest an African American. Is there a reasonable correlation between those two things? Is that the proper question, though? I guess that's not the proper question, because that would be like asking, well, is throwing the tea over that ship in Boston Harbor going to exacerbate the relationship between the colonists and the British government, or is it going to mollify and conciliate that relationship, right? So I guess that the question is, does this have any sort of rational correlation? Does going to the local Target store or the Kmart, the Walmart, or the Starbucks, wherever you go, right? In destroying that place, does that have any functional relationship to what may or may not happen to somebody whose civil rights may be abused in Minneapolis or any other city for that matter, right? Is this a coherent response to an epidemic of racism against African Americans and other minorities in this country by police officers? Is this a rational response? Does Target represent all the racist evils that have been associated with the history of this country? Is Target sort of the modern evolution of the Confederacy? No, I don't think you can make that argument. I think that would be a specious and ludicrous argument to make. I think that would be farcical to make that proposition. So I think be careful how far you go with this analogy. And I know you guys aren't really going, you're not going any further than I'm going. But I guess the other way to look at this, okay, and the other takeaway here is that if you say, assuming you say that the people who were engaged in the Tea Party, okay, that they had every right to do that, and that they were doing something that was patriotic, and they were taking a stand against tyranny, and they were making a point that their rights could not be abused unilaterally, and their civil rights could not be infringed upon without some kind of concerted response, right? If you believe all that, and you say, yeah, go ahead, destroy all the tea, right? Go ahead and ransack the ship there in Boston Harbor, then are you left with any argument against the people in Target, right? Do you have an argument against this? Because you know how some of these people, right, the people who participate in this, and indeed their defenders and their enablers, are going to pitch this, right? They're going to construe this in a way that is synonymous with the Boston Tea Party, okay? And again, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to make this stuff as relevant as I can. And sometimes it's a bit of a contrivance, as it may be here, but this is the best way for me to do this, okay? I think that what you could say, all right, about maybe not the rioters in Target, because I think Target is a pretty innocuous place. I don't know why you go to Target, because they got a lot of shit there that you want. That's why you go to Target, right? Because they got 60-inch HDMI television in there that you want, right? And that's gonna redress racism by stealing that television. No, but why would you, more generally, okay? Why would you engage in hooliganism? Why would you engage in civil disobedience? Why would you be lighting fires in, throwing Molotov cocktails randomly around in the streets of Detroit, or Flint, or Chicago, or wherever for that matter, right? Why would you be doing that? Is your destruction of public or private property, is that ever warranted? Is that ever justifiable? Is that ever excusable under the circumstances that you could say that, well, the underlying grievance that compelled me to go out there and throw that Molotov cocktail at that police car over there, right, or that that I don't know, that Buick that was sitting over there, right, was my desire, my inextinguishable and inexorable desire to see the systemic racism that is endemic to this country be redressed and ameliorated immediately. Can you say that my outrage, it was such that it overcame my rationale, my rational capacity to restrain myself and conform to the laws of the land, that I was so outraged that such was the opprobriousness of the offense that was committed against whatever his name was in Minneapolis, that such was my desire for righteous retribution, that I could not physically constrain myself from going out there and engaging in acts of hooliganism and participating in criminal activities. Do you think if one of these guys that was in Target there is hauled before the local district court, and he makes that argument, right, to the prosecution, that, oh, It's what they refer to as irresistible impulse, right? It's the irresistible impulse argument, right? Defense, rather. It's an affirmative defense. It's saying, I've got this compelling, this compulsion, this psychological pathology, which serves as a compulsion, and it overcomes my reason, it overcomes my self-restraint, it overcomes my capacity to conform myself to the laws of the country, and I just go out there and behave in a way that is completely inconsistent with the expectations of society. But alas, look, I had this overriding impulse, right? It is irresistible impulse. Is destruction at looting and pillaging at Target, is that ascribable to the irresistible impulse defense? I submit that it is not. Okay, and I suppose you could pitch this, you could contrive to finesse this argument in such a way so as to insinuate that, well, maybe it is, right? But I think that will be hard. That would be a harder case to make in the context of the Target store. Okay, maybe it would be an easier case to make if you went down to the local Republican Party office or something like that, right? I still don't think that would be defensible from a criminal standpoint. But what I'm saying is, be careful about giving categorical authorizations to these kinds of violent protests against the state. Don't just say that. We should just go ahead and allow people to express their sentiments in whatever way they think is the most effective and the most expedient and the most likely to compel other people to be to respond in a positive way to what they're doing. Right? Be careful about that. Now, I personally think that by going there and destroying property, they're disenfranchising, they're alienating people, they're causing people to disassociate themselves from that movement. They're not endearing, they're not ingratiating themselves to the sensibilities of anybody by doing that. They're dissociating their cause, right? Because a lot of people are going to look at that and say, it's completely out of proportion. Okay, next slide. The American Revolution. I should mention this. If you haven't read Chapter 2 yet, read Chapter 2. And read it carefully. Okay, when I read Chapter 2, and when I read any of these chapters, I take notes and I highlight certain sections of the book because I think that certain of these areas of the book are more important. You don't have to do all that, but I would just say read carefully. Okay, and for better or for worse, probably for better because it's easier for you guys. You can't be subjected to my question anymore. You just this format doesn't lend itself to an interrogatory, right? So you guys are kind of off the hook. Now that doesn't mean that therefore you should take a more lackadaisical approach to reading the book because you know that you're not going to be held accountable for answering questions in class because you never, let's face it, you never were held accountable for answering questions in class. I never picked on anybody. I never expected anybody to come to class and answer any questions that I was going to ask. I always answered them myself. But what I don't want you thinking is that I should let my guard down because now I'm not concerned about even the specter of being potentially called on in class, right? Because it's not feasible under the circumstances. The text is important in this class, okay? The text is very important in this class, and the reason it's important is because I may not do an 100% effective job at articulating these concepts in a way that is actually, it resonates with you, okay, that it makes some kind of sense, that it's completely coherent and intelligible to you. And if I'm not doing that 100% of the time with 100% of the material, and I have to believe for some of you at least that's probably the case, that I'm not, right, then it behooves you to avail yourself of the text, because now a lot of what I say is just, it's sort of spontaneous, it's extemporaneous, it's not stuff that you're going to find in the textbook at all, right? It's stuff that I'm just adducing because I think it's relevant, and it's supplemental to what you're going to find in the book. But the most important, the most paramount and quintessential elements of this class are going to be, in many ways, reiterated by the text, right? So continue to read the text, please do so. And actually now I realize I'm coming up on an hour and 24 minutes now, so I gotta actually close escrow on this. Read Chapter 2 if you haven't done so, okay? Please do so by as soon as possible. We are going to skip Chapter 3. All right, I skipped Chapter 3 entirely. There's nothing in there that's really worth reading. I read, I don't know, about maybe 25% of it, and I thought it was just completely, I don't want to say completely useless, but it wasn't really instrumental in elucidating the subjects that are most important to understanding political science. Let's just put it that way. So, skip Chapter 3, and when you have time, and this is not imperative for you to do anytime real soon, right? But when you have time, read Chapter 4, because that will be the next chapter that I'm going to be assigning to you guys, right? So skip Chapter 3, okay? Make sure you read Chapter 2, and that is important, and do so as quickly as is feasible for you. And then later on, maybe next week or later this week, read chapter 4 when you have time to get around to it. Because what the next PowerPoint slide is going to address itself is going to be the substance of chapter 4. Okay, so I think I'm on slide number, I don't know, 4 or 5, and the slideshow number 2, I think. I think we're only in PowerPoint slideshow number 2, but that's okay. As I said, it behooves you guys for me to go as slow as possible. The less material I cover, the less you're going to be responsible for on the test. The easier, therefore, the test will be for you. But the next PowerPoint slide after this one, okay, so PowerPoint slide number 3 will concern itself with chapter 4, right? So that's where we're at right now, and I hope this was coherent. I hope this was somewhat helpful, and if you guys got any questions or concerns, feel free to reach out to me. You guys know how to contact me. Be safe, be well, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and I will hopefully talk to you soon, sometime in the near future. Bye.